This is Dermatology Weekly, where we bring you interviews with leaders in dermatology and the latest in dermatology news with new episodes dropping on Thursdays. I'm the voice of MDH Podcasts, Nick Andrews. And welcome to episode 70 of Dermatology Weekly. Coming up later, we have the best of peer-to-peer so far in 2020 as Dr. DeLeo is on vacation for American Independence Day. We wish you and yours a happy and safe holiday, and for all of our international listeners who are not celebrating American Independence Day, we wish you a happy and safe first weekend in July. Remember, you can contact the show by emailing us at podcast@mdh.com, and you can follow us on Twitter at mdhderm. And now, the latest in dermatology news. We begin today with new research from the 2020 annual meeting of the American Academy of Dermatology that reports that there are at least 5 dermatologic patterns in patients who are suspected of or confirmed of having COVID-19. And what's more, the knowledge base continues to evolve. Dr. Christine Coe is a professor of dermatology and pathology at Yale University. In a presentation, Dr. Coe said that the situation is fluid and that new studies are coming out daily. She went on to say that due to the need for rapid dissemination, a lot of the studies are just case reports, but there are good case series available. Dr. Coe based much of her AAD presentation on a collection of survey images and clinical data from 375 patients in Spain with suspected or confirmed COVID that was published online in spring of 2020 in the British Journal of Dermatology. In that research, 9% of cutaneous manifestations were early vesicular eruptions, mainly on the trunk or limbs. 47% were maculopapular, and 19% were mainly on the trunk and the acral areas of the erythema. Dr. Coe said regarding histology that the early vesicular eruptions are typically marked by diskeratotic keratinocytes, while urticarial lesions are characterized by a mixed dermal infiltrate. Patients can develop a spectrum of lesions that are suggestive of vascular damage or occlusion. Livedoid lesions may remain static and not eventuate into necrosis of purpura, but will self-resolve. Purpuric lesions and acral gangrene have been described, and these lesions correspond to vesicular occlusion on biopsy. A later manifestation of the so-called COVID toes with superficial and deep lymphocytic infiltrate. Dr. Coe noted that there are patients in the literature that have slightly different pathology with lymphocytic inflammation as well as occlusion of the vessels. She concluded by saying that there is a lot left to be uncovered and some patterns are going to be outliers. But for determining which skin manifestations are directly from coronavirus infection within the skin, we need more data. And the first validated criteria for Discoid lupus erythematosus has a sensitivity that ranges between 73% and 85%, and a specificity that ranges between 75% and 93%. This is according to new research presented at the 2020 annual meeting of the American Academy of Dermatology, which of course was held virtually. These criteria were presented by Dr. Scott Ellman, who was with the Harvard Combined Medicine Dermatology Training Program at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. He pointed out that classification criteria are the standard definitions that are primarily intended to enroll uniform cohorts for research. Back in 2017, he and his colleagues generated an item list of 12 potential classification criteria using the International Delphi Consensus process. 5 criteria represented disease morphology, 2 represented Discoid lupus location, and 5 represented histopathology. The purpose of the current study was to validate the proposed classification criteria. At 9 sites, patients were identified at clinical visits as having either DLE or a DLE mimicker. After each visit, dermatologists determined if morphological features were present. One dermatopathologist at each site reviewed pathology, if available, to see if the histopathologic features were present. Diagnosis by clinical features and dermatopathology were tabulated and presented as counts and percentages. Clinical features among those with and without DLE were calculated and compared with chi-square of Fisher's exact tests. The researchers used best subset logistic regression analysis to identify candidate models. In total, 215 patients were enrolled, 94 that were consistent with DLE and 121 that were consistent with a DLE mimicker. The researchers found that following criteria were more commonly associated with DLE compared with DLE mimickers. Atrophic scarring, 83% to 24%. Dyspigmentation, 84% to 55%. Location of the conchal bowl, 49% to 10%. Preference for the head and neck, 87% to 49%. You can read the complete data breakdown of the classification of criteria by clicking the link in the podcast notes. But Dr. Ellman acknowledged certain limitations of this study, including the fact that information related to histopathology was not included in the final model. And we conclude the news portion of the 70th episode with a possible COVID-19 vaccine on the horizon in July 2020. It looks like phase 3 prospective data will begin in July. Dr. Paul Offit is director of the Vaccine Education Center at CHOP, which is the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Dr. Offit said that there are now 120 investigational new drug applications to the FDA for COVID vaccines, and research says that there are more than 70 companies across the globe that are interested in making a vaccine. The Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, BARDA, has awarded $2.5 billion to 5 different pharmaceutical companies to make a vaccine. Dr. Offit said that the good news is that this coronavirus appears relatively stable. He said that although it is a single-stranded RNA virus, it does mutate to some extent, but it doesn't look like it's going to mutate away from the vaccine. Therefore, this is not going to be like the influenza virus where you have to give a new vaccine every year. He said that he thinks we can make a vaccine that will last for several years and that we know the protein we want to go after. Dr. Offit is a member of the Accelerating COVID-19 Technical Innovations and Vaccines, which is a public-private partnership formed by the NIH. According to Dr. Offit, the Phase 3 COVID-19 vaccine trial supported by BARDA will launch this month and will enroll 20,000 people in the vaccine treatment arm and 10,000 in the placebo arm. And that's it for episode 70 news portion of Dermatology Weekly. Derm Weekly will be right back with the best of peer-to-peer. And welcome back to Dermatology Weekly. We hope you and yours have a happy and safe holiday. Dermatology Weekly is produced by Elizabeth Mashkani and Melissa Sears. All of our podcasts are produced by our editor-in-chief, Dr. Ivan Oransky, as well as executive editors Mary Ellen Schneider and Kathy Skarbeck. I'm the voice of Derm Weekly. Remember, you can contact the show by emailing us at podcasts@mdh.com. Okay, let's get to the best of peer-to-peer. Up first is Dr. Candrice Heath.
This year, we've had the pleasure of hearing from our colleagues on a diverse group of topics impacting the way we, as dermatologists, practice medicine, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. From the continued use of biologics in psoriasis patients to adopting teledermatology to recommending products for African-American women. Today, I've selected the interviews our listeners downloaded the most to share with you. Up first, teledermatology. In May, our guest host, Dr. Candrice Heath, talked to Dr. George Hahn about how dermatologists can adapt their clinical practice to conduct quality teledermatology visits with their patients. Here's some of that interview.
Today, I am talking to Dr. George Hahn about telehealth and the impact on how we practice dermatology. Things have definitely changed. Dr. Hahn is from the Icahn School of Medicine in New York, New York. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Hahn.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So let's just jump right in. How do you really think dermatology is handling this change in practice towards telehealth?
I think we've, as a specialty, been doing a great job. So it's interesting. You might think that dermatology, being a primarily visual field, is well matched for telehealth. I think a lot of the things that we were trying to work through before COVID, before the pandemic, things such as malpractice coverage, things such as how to make sure you get high fidelity, good quality images. That's kind of just gone by the wayside in a sort of just let's try it and see what happens sort of approach, because we really have no choice otherwise. People are at home, they don't want to come out, they're not able to come out in a lot of cases. There are a number of guidances out there saying that the patient shouldn't be coming into the hospitals, for example, unless it's an urgent matter. So we've had to find a way to provide this care to patients. And I think even though, and I think we'll get to this in a little bit, even though there are HIPAA relaxations, so some of the issues that you might have dealt with before this, like getting a HIPAA secure video platform you don't need to worry about, a lot of privacy and security issues are still out there. There's all this issues about Zoom and the meetings being able to be guessed by other people. So there are still things to keep in mind, and we have to do the best for our patients. And I think as a field, we're starting to learn and kind of, it's jump-started the development and maturation of teledermatology to a large degree, such that I think we're going to see a lot more progress going forward in terms of our ability to conduct good quality teledermatology visits with patients.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. I think that this definitely has catapulted telehealth for dermatology and really for medicine in general to definitely a new level. Telehealth has allowed our patients to still have access to us during this pandemic. What types of skin issues are you seeing in your patients that can be managed via telehealth visits?
Oh, that's a great question. Actually, from a practical standpoint, we're seeing almost everything. And some of that is by design and some of that just happens. No matter how much you try to design a system, you try to tell patients, well, we're not really that good at examining concerning lesions over telehealth necessarily. There are certain things that you have to come in for. People are still worried about the new skin growth, and they're still worried to come out. So you put those two things together, and you're going to end up seeing some patients in your practice with concerning lesions that you can't really make out on a choppy video signal, and you're kind of stuck trying to figure out what you can do. We've come up with a number of solutions. First and foremost, we do tell people and kind of give them reassurance with a lot of the lesions that we're thinking about and talking about. You're able to get some history from it. You're able to give some guidance as to whether or not it may be safe to wait a little bit of time before they come in. And another thing that I've been doing recently is there's this genomic test for melanomas. I don't know if you heard about it. I hadn't used it very much before the COVID pandemic because, we could biopsy patients in the office, and certainly there was the advantage of being non-invasive. But now that the whole paradigm has changed, I've actually used it more than I ever did before, because invariably what happens is a patient comes in, and I'll tell you a real story of a patient coming in who his physical therapist pointed out a spot on his back. He was outside on a balcony trying to show me. He had his friend touch it to see if it was raised because he couldn't even reach it. So in the end, I just told him, look, we're going to send you this kit. It's pretty straightforward. You probably need somebody to help you do it, but you just send it back. And we have a pretty high confidence that if you get a negative result, it's going to be a negative test. So I think that's something, just one example of a resource that we might not have thought about before this, but now is turning out to be pretty useful. So I think that's one nice point. I think practically speaking, we're seeing everybody right now. Psoriasis, acne would be pretty easy to triage via telemedicine. So those are nice. Obviously, eczema are bread and butter diagnoses. We're going to have to do a lot more experimentation. Certainly, if there's a lesion that's scaly and erythematous, we're not able to tell with great certainty if it's tinea eczematous, if it's erythema annulare. So, there's some experimentation involved, but I think as long as you're upfront with the patients, they understand it too. And, you mentioned the explosion of telemedicine, and it really has been nothing short of that. Last year, all year, I think overall in the health system, we probably had about 2,000 to 3,000 telehealth visits. And this year, in March alone, when this thing was ramping up, by the end of March, I think the numbers I saw was like around 30,000. So it's just absolutely just kind of been a huge change in the way we practice medicine.
So we talked about some of the things that you're actually seeing patients for via telehealth, but what are those things that you still think warrant an in-person visit?
For in-person visits, I mean, certainly it's very hard to recapitulate a total body skin exam over telemedicine. There are ways to do it. Certainly usually it involves another person helping. But even then, it really leaves too much to be desired, I think. And I think those are really better off being seen in person. We actually are upfront with patients telling them that it's very hard to determine lesions that you're concerned about in terms of precancer, that kind of thing, or cancerous growths. But people still schedule the appointments and want to see you. So we have to find some way to help them as best we can. And that's where, things like getting a more thorough history, talking to them more about it, symptoms, things like that can be very helpful. So I think those are the main categories that I'm a little less comfortable triaging. But I can tell you, we have patients who we've never met in person who we've started biologics on for psoriasis or atopic dermatitis. So I think with regards to most of the other things that we think about, if you really break it down and think about it, absent those diagnoses where you really just are unsure of what's going on, if it's a pretty clear case of psoriasis, I would say that your treatment options are not limited by the fact that we're handling over telemedicine. And I think that's really nice for our patients. There's a number of treatments out there that you don't need laboratory screening for, so those are helpful to have on hand. So I think most of what we can do in person, we can accomplish, with the caveat that the total body skin exams, and especially pigmented lesions, I'm a little less comfortable triaging over telehealth.
I think that's a great summary, and thank you for sharing your opinion on that.
Our next interview focuses on hair care products for African-American women during the COVID-19 pandemic. Hair salon closures during the pandemic have left women of African descent to care for their own hair at home. In April, my colleagues at the Skin of Color Society, Dr. Lynn McKinley-Grant and Dr. Susan Taylor, talked about hair care products these patients can use so that dermatologists can help African-American women take care of their hair and manage dermatologic conditions. Here's the clip.
Well, today we're here to discuss with Dr. Susan Taylor her very recent and timely article entitled Hair Care Products Used by Women of African Descent, and a review of the ingredients. And this article was actually written and accepted by CUTA several months before the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic. And as the virus is spreading and closing many non-essential businesses, including hair salons and barbershops, and people are sheltering in place, women of African descent now have to take care of their hair at home, whether it's natural or processed. As a dermatologist, this article is going to be very important to hear about because of the ingredients and the need to be able to discuss with your patients what and how they should be taking care of their hair, and understanding the products that you might be able to recommend, or understanding the products that they're using and why they're using that. So, Dr. Taylor, I'd like to start with the first question of why is it so important that dermatologists be aware of common hair and scalp beliefs, misconceptions of care, and product use to ensure culturally competent patient interactions and treatment?
Well, so Dr. McKinley-Grant, it's just that. So it's important for all dermatologists to understand hair care products, the ingredients in those products, and know how to recognize and differentiate natural versus processed versus synthetic hair. This will ensure culturally competent interactions with our patients. And these are patients who often assume that you're not knowledgeable about their hair. If your hair is different from theirs, they'll just assume you don't know anything about it. Also, the knowledge will inform the dermatologist regarding the diagnosis of hair breakage as well as inform treatment recommendations.
And that's so true, and it develops such a confidence of the patients and the patient-doctor relationship. You discussed in the article 4 steps in taking care of hair of African descent, which includes washing the hair, conditioning it, whether leaving it in or the conditioner in or washing it out, detanglers, and styling the hair. And the article is very well written, as usual, in a very reader-friendly reference style where people could refer back to it as they discuss hair care products with their patients. But I was wondering if you could review the products in just kind of the broad categories.
Sure. So I think the first thing that's important for all dermatologists is to understand what kind of hair their patient has. So we divide that into natural hair, processed hair, and synthetic hair. So natural hair is hair that's not been altered with chemical treatments, and these chemical treatments break and reform disulfide bonds in the hair. So that hair is usually very curly or tightly coiled. Processed hair is hair that's chemically treated with a variety of straighteners. Now, synthetic hair, on the other hand, is made of plastic or acrylic fibers, and it is used for hair weaves and hair extensions with braids. It's also important to note that with the synthetic plastic hair, it can be flammable and it can cause a contact dermatitis. So I think that's important. So to really get to the heart of your question, it is important for all women to shampoo, to condition, and then everyone is going to detangle their hair and style their hair. So what we did was we did a literature search initially and had many keywords, including natural hair, relaxed or permed hair, and we came up with or identified about 80 different products. We then went to a couple beauty supply stores, a Walmart, and from that selected 57 products, which we really honed in on the ingredients. So from there, looking at the ingredient list and then looking at which products patients used who had natural hair versus chemically treated hair, we came up with a list of suggested shampoos, conditioners, leave-in and wash-out conditioners, detanglers, moisturizers, etc. I think the only way you can really learn about this is to name brand names. We don't usually do that in dermatology, but we thought it was very important in the article that dermatologists and primary care physicians be able to refer to these specific brands, and then they can discuss it with their patients. I always ask my patients, what products do you use, to shampoo and condition, etc. And often you will hear certain products over and over again, and you'll familiarize yourself with it and then go look up the ingredients. Now, for shampoos, there are a whole host of shampoos, some that are geared towards the African-American community and others to the general community. So overall, in regard to shampoos, some are more harsh than others, meaning they remove more of the sebum from the scalp and the hair, leaving the hair very dried out. So the sodium lauryl sulfate containing shampoos are the ones with the most harshest detergents. So for our skin of color patients, our African-American patients, we suggest shampoos that contain sodium lauryl sulfate, which is a much milder detergent to clean the hair, and it helps to leave the hair moisturized. So, for example, there's a Pantene product called Pro-V, a truly relaxed hair moisturizing shampoo that can work very well for chemically treated hair. For natural hair, Carol's Daughter is a brand that's very popular. There's a Black Vanilla Moisture and Shine shampoo. Now, with this shampoo, it contains cationic surfactants Now, this helps to clean the hair, but it also helps to maintain the curl pattern of the hair, and that's very important for natural hair. So those are but two of the shampoos that, based upon the ingredients, we recommend.
That's very helpful. I wanted to add an example of where dermatologists will need to know these things, but I had a friend who, she goes to a hairstylist, every 2 weeks. She's a public figure, and she has to, every hair has to be in place. But with the COVID-19, she's been home working and doing her own hair, and she's decided to go natural. So she sent me a picture of 3 jars, the front and the back, with all the ingredients, and they were all styling gels, and she needed to know which one to use first. There was a gel, there was a cream, there was another moisturizing something. So the products that she suggested I really wasn't that familiar with, so your article was very helpful. And I connected her with a hairstylist who is working with her. There are several stylists who are working with people, online and have hair appointments without actually seeing them. So that is, the hairstylist can be a resource also for the dermatologist, even though we really need to have a basic understanding. I agree with you about that.
So with COVID-19, many women are at home, me included, and it's important for women to understand that they have to continue to groom their hair. Just because no one sees you doesn't mean that you don't regularly shampoo and condition, as well as comb and style your hair. Now, I personally think this is a great time to minimize what you do to your hair in regard to heat from blow dryers and flat irons and curling irons. I also think it's a great time, if you have a weave or braids and extensions, to take them out, to really give your hair a rest. And it's an optimum time to really concentrate on conditioners for your hair.
Finally, in our most accessed episode of the year so far, Biologics during the COVID-19 pandemic. In April, Dr. Lawrence Green discussed how to counsel patients who are taking biologics to control their psoriasis during the COVID-19 pandemic. Here's what he had to say.
So as a dermatologist who treats a lot of patients with severe psoriasis with biologics, I have been asked multiple times these last several weeks about what the patient should do who's taking a biologic to control their severe psoriasis. Now, I've received calls from people who take anti-TNF inhibitors all the way to the anti-IL-23s. So, and I think it's important to take it patient by patient, but in general, I have told patients that if they stop their biologic for some time and the psoriasis comes back so that it's severe again, I think that is significantly more risky for getting COVID-19 than if them continue to take their biologic. That's because when someone has severe skin disease, we know that's inflammation not just on their skin, but occurring throughout their body. We know that leads to more risk for comorbidities. We know that patients with all this inflammation in their body are more at risk for infection in general. So I tell them that, and I say, look at the alternative. You stopped your biologic, and it'll take a few months for your psoriasis to come back. But when that happens, if you go back to where you were, you're at much more risk for COVID-19 infection than you are right now taking your biologic and controlling your disease. Now, they've understood that, so they realize it's important to take their biologic. That said, to go into details about biologics, we really don't know the effect, of course. There's no data on the effect of biologics helping or harming someone with potential COVID-19 infection. There's some information I can give you, some tidbits. I don't know if this will help or hinder your decision-making, but, for example, anti-TNFs may be useful in helping control pneumonia because there's a lot of TNF. We know that happens when people have pneumonias. But that said, on the other hand, we know that anti-TNFs are the most general immunosuppressive agent of the biologics. Patients are at increased risk for infection, small amount, very small, but are at increased risks, especially when you compare it to the anti-IL-17s and anti-IL-23s. I think those are much safer and have a less risk for infection than the anti-TNFs. So for patients taking an anti-IL-17 or an anti-IL-23, I think they're safer to continue those while this pandemic is going on. Now, if you have exposure and you know you're at risk, you've been exposed to someone, or you're starting to feel feverish, there's no doubt you stopped your biologic for the time being. Stopping a biologic for a few weeks will not bring your psoriasis back to you won't have severe psoriasis, so just a few weeks off won't make a difference in the long run. A few months off, like I mentioned, can make a difference. So I think people who take biologics need to take extra precautions in terms of staying away, social distancing, staying at home if you can. There's no doubt about that. Washing your hands, using hand sanitizer, not touching your face. All these things that the CDC recommends. But I recommend stay on your biologic as long as you can, unless you have exposure, you start to feel feverish. Even anti-TNFs at this point, if someone on an anti-TNF wants to switch to an anti-IL-17 or anti-IL-23 because the TNFs are a little more risky, perhaps I think that's a great idea. We can talk about that. But I think practicing the CDC guidelines is very important, and continue taking the biologic is very important. There are also other resources we as dermatologists can go to. The AAD is putting out lots of guidelines day after day after day. The AAD has a task force that's just been created to update the membership on COVID-19 infections and how our practices should be adjusting, and that includes information about psoriasis. The National Psoriasis Foundation also has some guidelines released about using biologics for COVID-19 infection. There are lots of resources for us to go to help us get through and help our patients who take biologics in this age of COVID-19 infection, besides the opinion I just gave you.